The most important thing NASA ever did in terms of its human spaceflight program was land an astronaut on the moon. So that would make it sort of a golden age. And when we all look back on this, probably 100, 200 years from now, they're going to remember the 20th century for only a few things. But one of them is going to be the moon landing. It's going to be something that children study centuries into the future.
Seconds and counting. We're still go on Apollo 11 at this time. T-minus 25 seconds.
On a beautiful Friday morning, the world holds its breath as three men, Neil Armstrong, Michael Collins, and Edwin Buzz Aldrin, sit atop a 363-foot Saturn V rocket, destined to become the first humans to land on the moon.
4, 3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff. 32 minutes past the hour. Liftoff on Apollo 11.
Pushing past Earth's gravitational force, the crew of Apollo 11 travels 4 days to reach the Sea of Tranquility and alter the course of human history.
30 seconds. Contact light. Okay, engine stop.
Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed.
Roger, Tranquility. We copy you on the ground.
Armstrong is on the moon. Neil Armstrong.
There was no question in Neil's mind that he was the first person to walk on the moon, and that was certainly the intention of NASA. While they were in the lunar module on the surface of the moon, and at that point that they're opening the door, Buzz suggests, well, it's easier for me to get out first, so why don't I do that? And Neil says, no, you're not doing that. So they have to do a little sidestep, and Neil gets off first.
On this July 20th, 1969.
That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
You got a bunch of guys about to turn blue. We're going to be busy for a minute.
Well, obviously, the famous words. They're very appropriate. And not all of the statements of the astronauts when they reach the surface of the moon are quite so memorable. That one clearly is. It's also one that's going to be quoted in the history books to eternity. People literally around the globe sort of paused for a moment, paid attention, were interested in what was taking place, were less concerned about maybe their day-to-day activities than they were about this kind of larger thing that they're living through, this historic moment. And there's all these fascinating recollections of people of where they were, what they were doing when they saw the moon landing. There's no question that that moon landing was the point at which everything that NASA does will be measured by.
The United States successfully accomplished its mission of being the first nation to plant its flag on the moon. But during the early years of space exploration, it was far from certain that Americans would be the ones to take that first small step onto lunar soil.
In NASA's conception in 1958, the objective was to beat the Russians at whatever the Russians were going to do. This was a Cold War era. NASA was fundamentally a Cold War agency created to demonstrate to the world that the United States was second to none when it came to science and technology. And this was really important because in the world's stage, the Soviet Union outwardly looked successful in high technology activities. Rocketry was one of those means in which they demonstrated their prowess very early on.
By October 1957, the first artificial Earth satellite was pronounced ready.
The Soviet Union launched Sputnik October the 4th of 1957, and the United States sort of responded to this as, oh my goodness, how can they do this and we didn't?
A man-made celestial body for the first time in history flew into space.
Sputnik 1 had been a little ball about the size of a beach ball and weighed 184 pounds. It wasn't terribly big, didn't do very much. It was just first. But the next month they launched Sputnik 2, which was about the size of a Volkswagen and had a dog aboard, Laika.
Laika had been groomed for the flight. It had been trained to live in a special container. The apparatus, weighed half a ton.
Laika would become the first animal to orbit Earth, but sadly would not return home, with her life ending a few hours into the journey.
On national television, everybody saw it, and it looked like not only could the Soviets do this stuff very, very well, the Americans couldn't do it at all.
The space team at Cape Kennedy runs into trouble. An Atlas Centaur rocket fails just 2 seconds after blastoff.
Now at Cape Canaveral, the first transition from missile to advanced space technology.
The Soviets continued to lead for a number of years. They were the first to send a satellite to the moon. They were the first to go to the backside of the moon and photograph it and send those images back. They were the first to engage in all kinds of activities with robotic space probes in that period between 1958 and 1961. But then in 1961, they launched Yuri Gagarin, a cosmonaut into Earth orbit.
The first strides into the unknown were about to be made.
In some respects, nothing did more to spur NASA's efforts and spur the funding for NASA than that one act on the part of the Soviets. They had put a human in Earth orbit. They had demonstrated that it could be done.
Then man would conquer solar space and acquire might and boundless power over nature.
It was a bad experience early on. All of that is what sparked the necessity on the part of Congress to pass legislation to create NASA.
I therefore ask the Congress.
President Kennedy in 1961 decided that we were seriously going to try to beat the Russians. And on the 25th of May, less than 6 weeks after Gagarin's flight, he announces we're going to go to the moon.
I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth.
And that's when he set the challenge. We're going to land a man on the moon by the end of the decade. And he was intent that the Americans lead the way. It was a really difficult task to kind of catch up. Going to the moon is hard to do, and the demonstration of that is the fact that nobody's been there since, really. There's a few robots who've landed, but that's the extent of it. There's a lot of technology that has to be mastered. You have to build a really big rocket to be able to get there. You have to create the life science capabilities to keep an astronaut alive for the period of time necessary to get there and back. You have to build other types of technologies, especially things like a lunar lander, built for flying in a weightless environment, in an airless environment, and in an environment that only has 1/6 gravity.
The proposed technique for simulating the lunar gravity installed a jet engine underneath or within the machine on gimbals, so the thrust was always vertically upward. I was most fortunate to be involved throughout the entire lunar flying development. I had the pleasure of flying every one of the machines. NASA management was forever worried about the reliability and safety of these machines and continually wanted to shut them down. But the pilots insisted they were vital to lunar landing preparation.
But those technical challenges were maybe even less significant than the managerial ones. How do you organize hundreds of thousands of people, billions of dollars of activity, all carried out all over the United States, and be able to bring all of the results of that together at one location, put it together, and then fly it to the moon successfully? And not do it just once, do it multiples of times, which NASA did.
Monitor descent. Descent.
While many on Earth hoped to travel to a new world, NASA had a particular sort of candidate in mind for its Apollo program. Candidates had to be men between the ages of 25 and 35 years old. They had to be in excellent physical condition and could be no taller than 6 feet.
The astronaut must learn to tolerate the heating he encounters during his fall back into the atmosphere. These quartz tube lamps produce great heat.
They must also have obtained a university degree in physical science or engineering and have logged at a minimum 1,500 hours of flight time. Psychologically, they would need to be emotionally stable, highly motivated, and not to mention brave.
Astronauts are fascinating characters, and there's a variety of personalities. But one of the things about them is that they're all military officers of one type or another, which means they have lived their adult lives in a very large bureaucracy that values order and discipline and obedience.
The astronauts consider this experience as probably the most important phase of their space flight environmental training.
We tend to have this perception that comes from Tom Wolfe's book, The Right Stuff, that these are kind of cowboys and they do whatever they want, so on and so forth. None of that was true. They might occasionally go off and do something that was a little bit out of the ordinary, but mostly they knew how to operate in a big bureaucracy and were very successful at it, or they wouldn't have been picked as astronauts. The other thing about them is that they are all sort of white, middle-class males, many of them from the Midwest. I don't think there's any accident that that's the case. Most of them went to school on the GI Bill. Many of them were the first children in their families to go to college. So at some level, they're sort of the all-American boys. Bottom line is astronauts want to fly. That's why they're there, and that's what they train to do, and that's in their DNA, so to speak.
Apollo 1 was intended to be a test mission, flying into low Earth orbit. The three men selected for this heroic operation were Command Pilot Gus Grissom, Senior Pilot Ed White, and Pilot Roger Chaffee. They would be the first men to embark on NASA's ambitious plan to reach the moon. Little did anyone know the tragedy that awaited them.
They weren't on a mission, they weren't flying, they were doing ground tests at the Kennedy Space Center trying to work on the first flight of the Apollo spacecraft with a crew aboard, and a flash fire breaks out and those men die in a matter of seconds.
All three were victims of the swift inferno which left the capsule a blackened shell. Investigators theorize that perhaps a short circuit or electrical overload may have sparked the blaze. 27 would-be rescuers were all overcome by smoke and heat. Entering Arlington National Cemetery, a horse-drawn caisson bears the body of Lieutenant Colonel Virgil Gus Grissom, one of 3 Apollo astronauts killed in a tragic flash fire at Cape Kennedy.
NASA had a reputation up through 1966 that it had this organizational structure that could solve any problem. And so it was the perfect system. And then suddenly, in January of 1967, they lose a crew in the most horrible of ways. At that point, public scrutiny starts to look at this in ways it had not previously. And people were asking the question, well, we knew it was expensive. We didn't realize how dangerous it was until you ended up with 3 astronauts dead. And maybe we should pull the plug on this thing. And there were members of Congress who were actively seeking that particular resolution. NASA handled that reasonably well. They did a fairly honest review of what was taking place and how it had taken place.
Now, from that point on, we've had many different tests performed on flammability of materials. We've discovered that many of the materials must be changed.
And it was gut-wrenching for everybody. It was a death in the family.
Apollo astronauts Chaffee, White, and Grissom, martyred heroes who gave their lives in total dedication to duty. Their memory will forever be honored.
The tragedy would have a profound effect on the course of space exploration history. Plans for a manned Apollo 2 and 3 missions were scrapped in favor of less risky, unmanned missions. It seemed that mankind would have to wait to step foot on our moon.
While scientists develop a fireproof fabric for Apollo spacesuits and a new hatch that will open in 3 seconds, America's man on the moon timetable still aims for a landing by 1970.
They fixed the technical problems. They tried to restore confidence, both in their activities as well as the larger technical system.
The next launch, 7 months after the fire, would be named Apollo 4. Apollo 4 and the subsequent missions leading up to Apollo 7 would all test different technological aspects necessary to safely send humans into space. It wasn't until October 11, 1968, that the Apollo program would deliver its first human crew into space for an 11-day test flight in low Earth orbit. But down on Earth, there was little time to celebrate.
1968 was a horrible time in the United States. It began with the Tet Offensive in Vietnam. It went through the assassination of Martin Luther King and riots that followed. Every city blew up at some point during that particular year.
There were moments when there was fear for the safety of the Kennedy party.
Assassination of Robert Kennedy, the demonstrations at the Democratic National Convention, and on and on and on.
After all of this strife, on December 21st, 1968, NASA launches Apollo 8, which became the first manned mission to orbit the moon before returning safely back to Earth.
Everybody sort of focuses for about a week on this mission in which these three astronauts circle the moon, take pictures of the Earth, and do broadcasts from lunar orbit over the Christmas holidays.
And the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. And God said, "Let there be light." And there was light.
Literally, they read from the first verses of the Bible and wished happy holidays, Merry Christmas, to all of the people on, as they said, the good Earth. There are only about a half a dozen pictures from Apollo that anybody remembers. And one of them is the so-called Earthrise picture, which was taken by that crew in 1968.
The impact crater with, oh my God, look at that picture over there. There's the Earth coming up. Wow, is that pretty? Hey, don't take that, it's not scheduled.
And you see in the foreground of this, the moon, gray, lifeless.
Hand me a roll of color quick. Oh man, that's great. Where is it? Quick.
And off in the distance you see a crescent Earth, blue and white, hanging in the blackness of space. And it signals to you the realization that, quite frankly, we ourselves are living on a little spaceship. And it's pretty little in the overall scheme of things. And there aren't any lifeboats. And maybe we better start to take care of it a little bit.
250 at F11.
That particular moment suggests that with all the strife, all of the contention, you can pause and think that, you know, there's more that brings us together than that keeps us apart. For a few moments, we all saw ourselves not just as a member of some particular nationality or a representative from some particular race or ethnic group or whatever it happened to be, but as a human being, we were all doing this one thing together.
We close with good night, good luck, a Merry Christmas, and God bless all of you on the good Earth.
With the success of the Apollo 9 and 10 missions, for those on the good Earth, the dream of landing on the moon became all the more real. The crew of Apollo 9 spent 10 days in low Earth orbit testing gear, including docking and redocking the lunar module. They were even able to perform 2 separate spacewalks. Apollo 10 became the second mission to orbit the moon and was the dress rehearsal for the eventual moon landing. Descending to an altitude of 8.4 miles above the lunar surface, the crew tested the capabilities of the lunar module's ascent engine ignition. Armed with the skills and knowledge amassed during these 2 successful missions, the final stage was set for Apollo 11.
This was the big show. This was the one that was going to do it. It's pretty remarkable, that particular crew and how they went about their work. Neil Armstrong was just about as no-nonsense as any one person can be. Very good pilot, very strong-willed, and was able to keep in check other personalities around him. And Buzz Aldrin was sort of a guy who tended to get excited and run off in one direction and then get excited and run off in another direction, and you had to keep him vectored. But Buzz was a fellow who did as much as anybody to help us get to the moon. He had a PhD in astrophysics. He had studied at MIT, and he was a key person in developing rendezvous and docking techniques in the 1960s, which you have to do if you're going to go to the moon. He was the key person, the key of all the astronauts in terms of working on the EVA, or extravehicular activity, putting on a spacesuit, going outside the spacecraft and doing something. It was Buzz who went into a swimming pool and said, we can sort of replicate a weightless environment in this swimming pool, and he figured out the procedures, and he worked on the tools that were necessary to do certain kinds of things and made it possible to do this EVA. Fancy way of saying walking in space.
Buzz and Neil would spend the next 22 hours and 26 minutes on the moon, but only 2.5 of those hours were walking on the surface. The science wasn't too complicated and consisted mostly of taking lunar samples, as well as observing and inspecting this uncharted alien environment.
Yeah, radio loud and clear. How's it going?
Roger, the EVA is progressing beautifully. I believe they're setting up the flag now.
Because nobody knew how the spacesuits would hold up, neither man would venture farther than 90 yards from the lunar module.
Oh, geez, that's great. Is the lighting halfway decent?
Yes, indeed. They've got the flag up now, and you can see the stars and stripes.
Beautiful, just beautiful.
I'm sure most of them were confident in the technology, but you've always got to have in the back of your mind that this is a test flight, that it's experimental, and that something could happen that is unexpected. And they were prepared for that.
Houston, guidance recommendation is pinged, and you're cleared for takeoff.
The folks at NASA may have had a little less confidence in the technology, and there were some who were concerned, what if we can't light that stage to send the ascent part of the lunar module back up into orbit? We got 2 astronauts on the moon who are going to die a slow death when their oxygen runs out.
This is Apollo Control,
And
Houston.
nobody liked that idea, obviously, and you're going to do everything you can to guard against it.
Beautiful. Very clear. Very quiet ride.
The world waited. Never before had so many people been attuned to one event.
Apollo 11, this is Hornet, over.
In spite of all the successes NASA's had since then, and they've had many, this is the one that's going to stand out. This is the one that everybody remembers and talks about.
So many people have done so much to give us this opportunity to place this American flag on the surface. To me, it was one of the prouder moments of my life.
We give ourselves a hometown party.
History will always remember these 3 valiant men who became the first to leave their footprints on a celestial body beyond our home planet. But they would not be the last.
The crew of Apollo 12, astronauts Pete Conrad, Alan Bean, and Dick Gordon.
1.
Over the next 3 years, the Apollo program launched 6 subsequent missions to land on the moon. 5 of them were a success.
Pete Conrad reports that your program is in.
Apollo 15 and 16 would bring a companion that captivated children and adults worldwide who wished that they too could drive through lunar dust and craters.
And suddenly the flames shot up until finally Apollo 17 was just a bright star in the sky.
Apollo 17, the final mission of the program, marked the last time that any human would visit the moon in the 20th century.
I was strolling on the moon one day in a merry, merry month of December. Now, May.
It was also the first time that geologists would have the chance to investigate our neighbor firsthand.
You get the tongs, John? Yep. I'll carry the rake. Look at the size of that rock.
Every rock that we examined had something new that I didn't expect. And surprises is what geologists like. That's why you're exploring, is to see the things that nobody's ever seen before. The quality and diversity of the Apollo sample collection, independent of Apollo 17, where you had an experienced geologist, is just remarkable.
We that this will be a symbol of what our feelings are, what the feelings of the Apollo program are, and a symbol of mankind that we can live in peace and harmony in the future.
No matter how much preparation you have for experiences like stepping on the moon, it's going to be more than you ever anticipated.
I mean, the first time that somebody climbs a hill outside their town and looks down on their town, they have a different and changed perspective on it. When you see the Earth from space, you do have a different perspective, and all the astronauts talk about this. You don't see any borders between nations. You know, all you see is geographical features, and sometimes you can see some human-made objects, and certainly at night you can see lights of cities. But that changes you when you see this in a new way. Some of them reflected on this in a variety of ways, and some of them in a very religious manner. Obviously, you know, I'm a part of this grander scheme that has been created for us in this universe. Others have had strikingly different perspectives. Rusty Schweikert came back as an avowed environmentalist. That's the most important thing we can do, he announced when he returned, because there's nothing more fragile than the Earth. All of them came back with a slightly altered perspective.
Even for those who may never gaze down on our home planet from such great heights, these 12 individuals and thousands of other men and women involved in the Apollo program forever changed humanity's view of our tiny blue dot. For the first time in history, humans on Earth looking towards the sky could imagine setting foot on worlds beyond our own and know that it was more than a dream.